Well, it's sure good to see all of you. Happy to have another opportunity to study in the book of Acts with you today. We're studying in Acts chapter 17, and we're in the midst of Paul's second missionary journey. And last time we had opportunity to study, we had Paul beginning his work at Thessalonica and the beginning of the church there. He had to leave that place too soon because of persecution that was stirred up against him, and he went to Berea and found a more favorable reception among the Jews there. Many Jews had searched the scriptures and saw that what Paul was preaching was so, and so started a new congregation there, and many people were converted, but some of the enemies from Thessalonica heard about the church and the gospel being worked there, and they came and persecuted Paul again, and he had to leave and was taken down as far as Athens. And when Paul got there, he sent and asked for Silas and Timothy to come to him immediately. Timothy came down, we know, and Paul was so worried about the Thessalonians and their faith and the persecution going on there that he immediately sent them back up to Macedonia. So Paul remained alone there in Athens, and that's where we left off in our account here in the book of Acts last time. In chapter 17 and verse 16, now while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was being provoked within him as he was beholding the city full of idols. So you picture Paul walking through the city of Athens, and there are many ancient accounts of, the different things that were there, many different statues, many different temples, and all kinds of idols that filled the city. And as we said, it wasn't a politically powerful city anymore after Alexander the Great and then the Romans, but it was a cultural city and a religious city, and it was filled with these altars to idols. And it provoked Paul. It caused him to be angry as he looked around and saw these substitutes for the true God. These inventions of the devil, really. They're things to keep people from doing the right thing. He encourages any kind of substitute for God, right? Any kind of counterfeit. And that's what idolatry is. People are being enslaved to the worship of images and false gods. And it provoked his spirit. And as we see people involved in error and their lives are enslaved by various sins and so on, we should want to do something about it, right? That's the way Paul provoked him to want to speak out and preach the gospel and try to convince people to turn away from these vain things and serve God. We're told about the abundance of idolatry that was in the city by different ancient writers. One says that the Athenians greatly surpass others in their zeal for religion. So it seemed like there was a lot of zeal in a lot of these ancient cities, but he says they went beyond everybody else when it came to worshiping idols. They had more than anybody in that city. Lucian said, on every side there were altars, victims, temples, and festivals. So he saw the city full of idols too when he got there. Petronius, he says it is easier to find a god than a man in Athens. So you go there, it's a lot easier to find a god than it is to find a man. You got as many gods as you have men. And a thing to shudder at, certainly, if you're a Christian and you look around and see all of this error that's being taught and people being led astray, it is something to be sad about. And demons are, of course, the object behind these idols, are what we're told. These are works of the devil, and demons lie behind idolatry. Paul said you can't go into an idol's temple and have the Lord's Supper both. You can't do both, because when you go into an idol's temple, you're sitting at the table of demons. And God won't allow you to sit at His table and that at the same time. Oh, you might try it and it might happen outwardly, but the Lord doesn't accept it, right? Because those are in opposition. So men were sunk in this degradation and all of this devil substitute. Verse 17. So he was reasoning in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be present. So Paul took opportunity as he was in the marketplace there. They had these stones set up along the way there that a philosopher could stand up on there and teach, and he'd have disciples gather around him to hear what he was saying, or they'd walk under the porches and people would follow them and they would teach their different philosophies. Well, Paul takes his stand also and begins to preach the gospel and has people coming and hearing what he has to say about the true God and about Jesus Christ and the resurrection and the evidence that's found there that could save you. And he started off, as always, in the synagogue, trying to talk to the Jews and reason with them on the Sabbath day, and trying to teach the proselytes, the Gentiles that were there following Judaism. But he was also working out there in that large area of the marketplace and teaching the people there. So temples, public buildings, statues, fountains, monuments were found in the forum there, the marketplace where he was at. So try to maybe picture all that in your imagination as Paul was walking around there and teaching and having random people coming up to hear the gospel being preached. And he'd done the same thing on the first missionary journey at Lystra. You remember he taught there right outside the city gates in the marketplace when he healed that man that had been lame. It was the same kind of situation. He taught the same kind of sermons there to these Gentiles. So he's working hard in the city to convert both Jews and pagans. We're going to find in the city of Athens he doesn't have a lot of success. He converts some, but not the many multitudes like he does in some other cities where he went. It says, and also some of the Epicureans and Stoic philosophers were conversing with him. And some were saying, what would this idle babbler wish to say? And others, he seems to be a proclaimer of strange deities, because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. So there are two different groups of philosophers that are mentioned specifically as interacting with Paul and reasoning about what Paul was preaching. The Epicureans and the Stoics. An Epicurean taught that pleasure is the highest end of living. Epicurus, of course, is the one that came up with that philosophy. And he meant by good pleasure to be generous and kind and patriotic. But not a lot of his disciples had those same high ideals about what was pleasure. A lot of people, it's just pleasures of the flesh, right? Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. That's associated with Epicureanism. You just live your life for all the pleasure you can get out of it fleshly, and that's all that life's worth. And a lot of people live by that philosophy, whether they call themselves Epicureans or not today. It's all about just having as good a time as you can, buying as many things as you can. Whoever has the most toys wins. You see that on bumper stickers and things. That's what life is, just pleasure, whatever pleasures you can get. And they had the idea that matter is eternal, that it didn't have any creation. And that's really what a lot of our evolutionists believe too, that there's always been matter. And we don't need a God. Everything can just happen by evolution, right? So the Epicureans were teaching that way back there in Paul's day and before. And they denied there's any creator you got to give an answer to. So it doesn't matter how you live, just have as much fun as you can while you're here. And they denied the immortality of the soul, so they didn't believe you had life after death. So eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. That's the Epicurean philosophy. And the idea of any kind of future punishment after death, they didn't believe in that. There's no providential influence by God in shaping history and people's lives where God is in control over things. They didn't have that idea. And a lot of people today, don't they live the same way? They don't think God has anything to do with anything. It's all just happenstance, right? Whoever happens to be the most powerful or whatever. Well, that's one side. Then there's the Stoics on the other side. Zeno was the father of the Stoic philosophers, and he taught on a porch, a stoa. And so they got the name Stoics because of his place of teaching. And he taught that all things were governed, that Zeus created everything. So there is a creator God. And that everything is governed by the fates. Even Zeus had to deal with the fates. And so there is something outside of this history we're living that is controlling. It's a different, similar concept of providence anyway. And they had self-denial, contributed to the highest ends of life. So you tried to control your passions and affections. You needed to suppress them and restrain them and practice self-control and not be carried to too excessive happiness or sadness or let anything bother you, basically. It's like you don't let yourself be affected by anything is part of their philosophy. And they denied the immortality of the soul in the sense that we think about it. You as an individual, you live here and then you die and your soul goes to God and He determines what happens to it. They had the idea, like the Hindus or the Buddhists, that you get this spark from God, which is your soul, and it passes through different bodies and so on, or different people, and then finally in the end it all gets absorbed back into the one Spirit of God. Right? That doesn't sound too hopeful to me. It doesn't give me much encouragement, but that's sort of the idea behind it. That they have this transmigration of the soul, and then it gets absorbed into the divine essence in the end. Well, we're taught that we're created, right? And we have an individual personality and soul. And it's eternal, that internal spiritual part of us. And it's going to live on after this life is over, one way or another. So you have these two different extremes there, and they're both listening to Paul. And they say, what is this babbler saying? The word translated babbler means a seed picker. It's the literal meaning of that word in Greek. It's a little bird that hops around and picks up scraps of grain. And then it was used for poor people who collect seeds out of the field that are left behind, and who hung around the shops picking up scraps, and men who picked up scraps of information here and there. So it evolved into this idea: you just grab a little of this philosophy and a little of that philosophy, and you use synergism. You kind of put it all together in an amalgamation of ideas and teach it. So a little of this sounds like this philosophy that Paul's preaching, and a little bit sounds like this other, and he's just a babbler that's picked up little bits here and there and has put it all together, because they couldn't pigeonhole him in one group, as to where he fit, as the gospel would fit. And so others were saying he's teaching strange deities. There's other deities that we've never heard of that he keeps talking about. Didn't they have deities like hope and faith and trust? And they had deities of every different kind you can think of. And here Paul's teaching Christ, and he's preaching resurrection. They're thinking those are two different gods that he's talking about. The God of resurrection, or the God of Christ. He's teaching Jesus and the resurrection. So Paul we know what the center of his preaching was all about. I guess it's the same ours should be too, right? Preach Jesus and the resurrection. That's a central part of how you convert people. And he emphasized Jesus is the Savior of the world and the resurrection of the body of all men. And it's all guaranteed by the resurrection of Jesus that we're going to be raised and we're going to stand in judgment. And they're wondering, what does all of this mean? Anybody else have a thought on the setup here? The situation in Athens and what was going on there? Anything anybody wants to add? All right. Well, they want to take this to a higher authority to examine this teaching that Paul has brought in. Is this legal? What Paul is teaching? Is it proper? They have a group of judges that are appointed to oversee the city and what is taught there and so on. The Areopagus is up on the Areopagus, it's used two ways. It's used to talk about the hill where the judges sit and where the court is held. And then it's also used for the judges that sit in the court. So they're Areopagites. Or the Areopagus is the court and it's the mountain. And Aro is the name in Greek for the god of war, right? Ares. In Latin, he's called Mars. So you see in the King James Version, when you see this account and what you're probably familiar with, and I say it too, Mars Hill, that's the Ares Hill. And in our Greek New Testament, it has Areopagus. But when the King James Version came out, right, they were using before that the Latin Bible, right? That was what their scriptures were written in. And they all used the Latin names for the gods and for places. And so when they did the King James Version, instead of translating it, they put in the Latin words, right? You see the same thing in the next chapter when it talks about Diana of the Ephesians. That's Latin. What it actually says is Artemis. That's the Greek. But they got Diana from the Latin Bible and brought it over in the King James Version. So anyway, it's the reason you have different names for some of these things in modern translations and in the King James Version. So this peak there, Hill of Mars or Hill of Ares, was this height there in the city. It's separate from the Acropolis, where you see those temples and things today. If you went over there, there's a separate hill, which is Mars Hill or Ares Hill. We'll look at it on some other pictures. And they had benches that were cut into the rocks there, and the judges sat in kind of three sides of the person that's speaking. So Paul is really, when it says he's in the midst of the Areopagus, they're actually all around him on either side and in front when he preaches the sermon. So he's there on the summit of this hill. You went up 16 steps to get up to, and it was sort of a preliminary hearing that Paul is getting to whether he needs to be charged with a crime for teaching strange deities that they haven't heard about before. But Paul, of course, is trying to convert the judges. He's there to preach the gospel, and didn't Jesus say you're going to be drugged before governors and judges, and that'll give you an opportunity to preach? Do you have a thought? So here is a map of Athens, and let's see if some things. The Agora is the marketplace where Paul was walking through and teaching there, and the Areopagus Hill is pointed out in the Acropolis. Here's the Areopagus, that white stone that's sticking up there. There would have been a court on top of that. You went up on top with seats. It says, on his visit to Athens, Paul gave a speech to the learned of the men of the city at the Areopagus, Mars Hill. Mars Hill is a prominent site located 140 feet below the Acropolis, and in Paul's day was the meeting place of the main governing body of the city. While some think that Paul's appearance here indicates some sort of judicial proceedings, most see the reference as only the location of his preaching. So there's two views of that. There is the steps that you go up on if you were over there as a tourist and wanted to go up and stand where Paul was standing. Walk up those steps to where the court was located. And Paul then would stand there before those judges on the hill. It says, for you are bringing some strange things to our ears, and we want to know, therefore, what these things mean. Now, all the Athenians and the strangers visiting there used to spend their time in nothing other than telling or hearing something new. So Luke tells us about what they were saying and the attitude of the people in the city, and it gives you some indication why you're not going to convert any of these people. They're not very much, you have to have a deep root to become dedicated to following Christ and this way of life. And if all you're interested in is what's new and what's newer, that's your view, you're never really stuck in anything. You're not ready to commit to anything. And that's the type of people that were there in the city of Athens. So things startling and bewildering are coming before their ears, and they want him to go before these judges on the hill so that they can look into this matter and understand it more clearly. So they're affirming, what's he affirming about Jesus and the resurrection? And again, they had all these young students, came from all over the empire. You'd go there to get your upper education, your doctor's degree in philosophy. You go to Athens and follow these great philosophers around and learn what they had to teach and then take it back where you came from. And so always looking for some new thing to listen to. Not very deep. We need to be looking for the truth, really. It's what we should do. So Paul's bringing strange things. They want to know more about his teaching. Athens, again, they want to know what's new and what's newer. In verse 22, it says, "And Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, 'Men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all respects.'" So he's standing there on the hill with these judges, and he begins to preach a sermon. And it's, of course, a very fascinating sermon. We have only, I'm sure, the outline of what he said that day. He probably went into each of these points in greater detail. But Luke, as a good historian, he kind of summarizes for us so that we have a record of some of the things that Paul said on that occasion. So he starts off with very respectful language, as I understand it, even though these people are idolaters. He says, "Men of Athens, I observe you are very religious in all respects." In the King James Version, it translates it, "I see that you are very superstitious." And there's two ways you could take the word that Paul used. It's the word for demon worshipful is literally what the word means. You really worship your demons, right? You really worship all of these different spiritual beings, is the way they looked at it. As they looked at demons, a demon was something kind of below a god and above a man in the sense that it was maybe some deified man after death that they have a throne to or a religion to. So these things that are higher than human beings. You're really fearing of your deities, is what the Thayer says. Deity or deities. In a good sense, reverencing gods and gods, pious or religious. In a bad sense, superstitious. So there's a judgment call you have to make. I kind of think he wasn't just coming out and trying to insult them right off the bat. That doesn't seem to be Paul's way. So he uses a word, though you can take it either way, but I assume they would have taken it in a positive way. Yeah, we are very religious in the worship of all of these things. And again, it's an attention giver. You have to, maybe you go, what does he mean? Does he mean it this way or that way? Yes. Yeah, you're very scrupulous here about your religion and all of these spirits and so on. But you've got an altar here I found that's one that you need to know more about, right? The one that you're ignorant about is the one I've come to preach to you about. So they're in fear of all kinds of evil spirits and all kinds of different powers that are out there in the spirit realm. And they're very concerned about it. So, it would be a good thing to bring people the gospel, right? And say, this is the way to be right and not to have any fear of these things. There is one God and that you need to be serving, that's interested in you, that loves you. It says, "For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. What therefore you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you." So Paul finds a perfect opening for his sermon when he finds they're trying to cover every idol and spirit out there that they can think of. And just in case we missed one, we got one to an unknown God. We don't want to leave him out. Paul says, that's the God I want to talk to you about. The one you confess yourself you don't know about. And he's going to tell them about the true God in heaven that they don't know about. So Paul attentively studied their objects of worship. That kind of shows respect, doesn't it? I went around and I examined everything about the way you do things here. It's said that they had from 2,000 to 3,000 idols in the city. So that's a lot of objects of worship that had been set up. And of course, an altar is where you'd offer sacrifices to these different gods and goddesses that were set up there. And now I'm going to tell you about the unknown God, who he really is, who his son is, and how you can serve him. Now, they're yearning to worship, but they're ignorant. Not just a babbler. He's come to give them some information they don't know about. He hasn't just borrowed a bunch of stuff from other people. He's got something they don't know about that he can tell them. And all about his names and attributes. The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands. So the main object of his sermon was to show them the folly of all of these idols that they're serving. Said the true God that made everything, he is so great, he would not need anything made by man for him to live in, right? And that makes sense. If he created the universe and all of the galaxies that are out there and everything, would he need a little building somewhere that he could live in and have you bring him food? You know, I know over in I remember people telling me about Vietnam, and they had altars set up there, and people would lay food out, you know, that was supposed to be for the gods and the spirits and so on there, just like this. Does God need somebody to bring him some food if he created everything? So Paul says God, and he uses the singular as opposed to their many gods. God, the maker and creator, that would certainly be opposed to the Epicureans and what they had to say. And he is a God that is in control of all things, and he made the world, the cosmos. He is Lord of heaven and earth. If he's Lord, then he has control, right? Belongs to him. So there's providence where they denied providence. He is controlling things. He is the God and Lord, and he's active in the universe. You can see that as God's people, certainly we shouldn't deny that, to think God just went off somewhere and he's just retired from work and it's all just us down here doing things. No, God is also involved in the things that are going on in this world. And he's infinitely above all of these gods and their dwelling places and temples and different altars that they have. And Solomon, you know, he pointed out continually when he dedicated the temple that God is not going to dwell in this temple, right? Not in the literal sense. He couldn't make God dwells in heaven. I can't make a temple big enough for God. But he wanted God to put his name there and to hear the prayers that were offered there and to protect that place. Neither is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all life and breath and all things. So this God that you don't know about, he created everything. He is too transcendent to be able to be located in a temple. And he is one that can't be served in the sense that he needs the service of human hands. Worshippers used to, again, set food before these idols every day and so forth. And the true God doesn't need the help for his existence, since he is the cause of all existence. And the Bible emphasizes all that God has done and continues to do for his worshipers. The Greeks didn't look at gods that way. It was all about what they might do to us. We got to appease them or whatever, but they weren't like doing things that we needed to be thankful for and looking out for our best interest all the time. That wasn't their idea of God. It says God is the source of life, and so he can't be dependent on other people for his life, right? He's completely independent from that, wholly independent. And the word life there is being, of course, what gives you vitality, what animates you is that word Zoe or Zoe that is used there. And that's interesting, isn't it? Like we study zoology. That's animals, right? They're animated. They move around. You got botany and so on. You study plants. They don't get up and walk around like people, animals do, right? So there's a different word there for that study. And he gives us not only our life, our vitality, but He gives us what is necessary to maintain it. He created our life, and He gives us breath that we need to maintain our life. Just like we needed bread and water, we also need air to breathe, right? And breath in our lungs, or we can't live. So without the breath of life, you die. And God provides that. So He's the creator and the preserver and the sustainer of everything that men need. So certainly, He's not a God like you're picturing God and all your idols that you have. He's completely different than that. And He made from one every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation. So He created every nation and race of mankind. There's really just one race, the human race that God made. Started off with Adam and Eve. And our DNA and stuff confirms this, that we're all related. We all go back to a common source. And we all go back, to Noah and his 3 sons. That's really where we go back to. And says He's made from one everybody that lives on the face of the earth. How different was that than what they believed? Didn't you have a God of the Greeks, and a God of the Assyrians, and a God over the Babylonians, and a God is in Egypt that made the Egyptians? And no, there's one God, and He made everybody from one blood, right? We all come from the same family. And again, that's different than a lot of evolutionary views that people have had in the past, where they had all this racism and prejudice because this is an inferior race and I'm a superior race and all of that. No, we're all one race, is what the Bible teaches. And we're all made by God. And He's determined, He overrules through His providence where people can live and what their boundaries are, what our limits are. God sets all of that. And He's involved in the rise of nations and kings and the downfall of nations and kings. It's not all up to us. We think if we just had a big enough army and this and that and so forth, but people with bigger armies have been defeated, haven't they? People with more wealth have been defeated by people with less. You go through history, there are all kinds of exceptions to every kind of rule you can think of. And we're told God is behind many things that happen as far as the rise of nations and men. So we all come from God. He determines our destiny. And providence is working in all nations. There are a lot of boundaries that He has set and determined. I guess you could say there's a lot of geography involved in where different people end up and what their boundaries and habitations are. But there's also things above and beyond even that that set barriers for where people can go and what they can do. Anybody else have a thought on this passage? There's a lot to think about. A lot to think about there. There certainly are, I've heard people talk about just the limits on our habitation as far as living at the bottom of the ocean. A lot of people have talked about that, but it hadn't worked out yet, because we can take some air with us, but we're kind of limited on living under the water. We're a lot of talk about going to Mars and living on Mars and all of that, but I don't know. We're going to have to take everything with us, right? Including soil and everything. We're kind of limited. The boundaries are set on where we can inhabit as human beings. So even on a macro scale, it kind of fits, doesn't it? The nations are where they're at for a reason, and we're limited on where we can go as a species too, what we can do. Verse 27, they should seek God, if perhaps they might grope for Him and find Him, though He is not far from each one of us. So God has so ordered things and oversees things in such a way as to cause men to seek after Him. And people do have this desire to worship something, right? It's built into us. And God wants us to grope for Him and find Him. And He says He's actually not far from anybody. But yet people are trying to find God in all these different things. And He's not far from anyone, because we live in Him. He's omnipresent, right? That would be another way to talk about that. In Him we live and breathe and have our being. We're in God. The word grope for means to handle, to touch. I think in the King James, doesn't it say feel after? Or what is the expression that's used there? It's this idea of groping around like you're in the dark trying to find somebody. And without the Bible, isn't that where we'd all be? We'd all be groping around trying to find. We'd see certain qualities about God in people, and you see certain qualities about God in nature and in creation. But as far as the details about God and how to serve God, you have to have the Bible and revelation from God to be able to find Him. So before the gospel came, a lot of these people are just groping around in the dark, right? Yes, Brother Bill? Feel after, okay. So that gives you that root idea there. You're groping for it, feeling after it. And isn't it great that we have a revelation now? Well, we'll come back and look at the conclusion of Paul's sermon and what the judges decide and how that all turns out next time.